window. Thank you for joining today's webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a couple of technical issues. If you come across any problems, please chat to the host. At the end of today's webinar, please complete our brief survey to give us some ideas for topics you would like covered in the space that we're working in today, or any other areas related to children and children's mental health and behavioral health. And just a reminder, during the conversation, you can chat in your comments or questions to our panelists, and we'll compile those and hold those until the end of the presentation. So thanks again for joining us, and let's get started. So on behalf of the Community Technical Assistance Center of New York, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the latest installment of Conversations with Dr. Tony, featuring our speaker today, Cendie Stanford. My name is Dr. Jim Rodriguez, and I'm the coordinator and the director of trauma-informed services at McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research. One critical feature of trauma-informed care is raising awareness of the prevalence and impact of trauma and childhood adversity on the physical, psychological, and spiritual well-being of children, youth, adults, and families who've been exposed to it. Today, Dr. Tony Salerno, the practice and policy scholar at the McSilver Institute, will be speaking with Cendie Stanford of ACEs Matter to talk about how we can raise awareness about ACEs. Cendie is a person with lived experience with ACEs. She founded ACEs Matter, and ACEs Matter is an organization dedicated to raising awareness of ACEs and to, according to its mission, quote, start the conversation about ACEs in any community, home, or school that wants to break generational cycles of childhood abuse, dysfunction, and neglect. Before I turn it over to Dr. Tony, I wanted to give Cendie Stanford an opportunity to introduce herself.
Dr. Rodriguez, thank you so much. As Dr. Rodriguez said, I'm Cendie Stanford. I am actually located in Orlando, Florida. And the reason why I get to be in front of you all today is because my goal with this program is to raise awareness and be one of the loudest voices online when it comes to talking about adverse childhood experiences. And I ended up finding my way to this conversation because of our raising awareness using the internet. So I'm here today to say, thank you for joining the conversation. Thank you for staying in the conversation, even though it can be uncomfortable. And then thank you for continuing the conversation. If you want to know more about the program and some of the ways that we are raising awareness in different ways with our stories, you can visit acesmatter.org. And again, I'm Cendie Stanford. I am a former school principal, and I am a lived experience survivor of childhood trauma and toxic stress. And so the voice that I bring to this table is a voice of experience with childhood trauma, and then also a voice of somebody who learned about ACEs and immediately wanted to do something with that information. So thank y'all for say, I want to share this with whoever will listen. So my shift happened when I realized I have to continue addressing my healing anytime something triggers me, especially if I can't make sense of it. So during those 42 years, I'm going to start from the adult part, from the time I left the house at 17, up until the time I became aware of ACEs at 42. I realized I couldn't hear feedback because the first thing ACEs come for is your ability to think critically in a lot of toxic, stressful situations. I didn't know that. So naturally, I was looking at myself, well, why is everybody else getting it? This is just not making sense. And so I was constantly blaming myself, a lot of negative self-talk, purchased lots and lots of books, self-help. I was one of those people in the self-help market stuff that spends hundreds of dollars on self-help stuff, right? I wanted to get better. I wanted to fit in. And nothing was making sense to me. And so what I'd never understood from all the things that I was exposed to reading, right, was that I needed to go back to my childhood. What I was told growing up is just pray about it and God will come fix it. That was my culture. Something's wrong, pray about it. God will come fix it. And I was trying, I was praying, and for whatever reason, I could not hear. And then I learned that until I can teach my brain how to be calm and present, then everything's going to seem like it's a threat to me. And the second thing I think applies to this is that in my household, and this may apply to the listeners or other people. I've seen a lot of commonalities in this, no matter what color you are, no matter what income bracket you come from. This is like opening up Pandora's box, if you will. We grew up being told what happens in this house stays in this house. You do not talk about what goes on in this house. And the one time I remember, I would have been maybe in 6th grade. My younger brother ended up disclosing that my grandmother had grandmothered with her aces. And when she found out that I want to say he might have been 3rd or 4th grade at that time, she found out that he had spoke about something in the house, and then he was at school acting up in 4th grade, doing what he do, not even noticing that his aces were causing him to act up. So going back to what happens in this house stays in this house, he broke a cardinal rule. He shared something unknowingly as a maybe 8-year-old, and it got out. CPS showed up at our door the very next day. Grandma was not happy about that. He's 8, he didn't know, right? So she grandmothered the way she was parented. She showed up at the school, and in front of his entire class, the teacher allowed her to spank him. Because of that experience that stuck with him and me, because they pulled me out of school in middle school to interview me as well. I had to stick with the culture. If it happens here, we don't speak about it, because no way will I let my grandmother come up to school and whoop me in front of my entire class. But she was grandparenting the way that she was parented.
You mentioned something really important, and that is, the secrets in the family, right? The things that you don't talk about to other people. And a lot of the folks who are on this particular conversation, they're working with families and with kids. And I wonder if you have some insights into what keeps that kind of stigma going and that kind of secretiveness. And for a practitioner, they would like to be able to create an opportunity for families and children to be able to share some of the things that have happened to them or continue to happen. But there could be a big stigma associated with disclosing that. What's that all about? What is this, the idea that this is too shameful or to speak of, and what might help practitioners, what they need to do in order to create an environment where it was safe?
That's a really good question. And I will say, I did not start going to therapy until I was forced to, when my daughter tried to commit suicide the first time. And of course, I just blamed it on her teenage hormones and blah, 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 blah. So that was the first time I went to therapy, which would have been in the 2000s. What I could have used for my therapist then, which again, that wasn't the season for me to learn about this. What I could have used then was mirror and shadow work. Because I was also parenting with my aces, which led to my daughter doing what she called as relieving herself from life. Now that I'm 2 years down this rabbit hole, if you will, Brene Brown uses this quote in her last book where she says, vulnerability is the first thing we look for in other people, but it's the last thing we want to show about ourselves.
Right.
So I think my most impactful therapy session happened shortly after I lost my job in March of 2020. That therapist used the entire hour asking me questions that required me to do shadow/mirror work. And what evolved from that therapy session when I was 41 was that I was walking around with a bowl of resentment in my gut because I had never learned how to use the words to communicate how I was feeling. I would either shut down or ruminate and blame myself. And then I would go into work, relationship, or any situation you can think about with this bowl of resentment sitting in my gut. And when she opened that up for me, I didn't need therapy anymore, right? It was like, oh, okay, because therapy is not supposed to be a long, ongoing thing, right? You're not supposed to renew therapy every 12 months unless you have, like, it's supposed to be like, hey, get in here, at least in my opinion, like, get in here, let me help you with this. And then I realized I had only been with this particular therapist for probably maybe 5 months. And when she took the conversation where I was forced to look in the mirror, I immediately knew that the world has been pretty rocky as far back as Genesis. For those people who are in the Bible, like, the world may not change, but we can change how we look at the world. But we first have to like do that inner and self work, because at the end of the day, there are going to be people who don't actively work on their mental health or their emotional intelligence. And they may be serving your food, pumping your gas, your husband, your wife, your teacher, whatever. It may be those people. And at the end of the day, I wanted to be better prepared whenever I was in the presence of people who are not actively doing the work. Because what that was telling me is that those people may or may not have heard about emotional intelligence, ACEs, whatever we want to call it. But I know the one thing that that person could use that I now have the tools to give, and that's compassion. I can't give compassion if I haven't started giving it to myself. So I would say for clinicians, like, if it's possible, the vulnerability part, like letting people know, like, our message at ACEs is that ACEs didn't start with you, but they can stop with you. And the quicker we can get people who are ready to do shadow and mirror work, the quicker they can accept things that cannot be changed.
You know, you make a really very important point, and maybe it speaks to why you started ACEs Matter in the first place, is that this information that people may be getting in schools or as professionals, you want to make sure that folks know about this, that you want the public to be aware of the relationship, the connection between going through some very difficult life experiences, particularly growing up, and the current problems or disappointments or struggles that you're having today. That information, knowing that, makes a difference. And, you know, in my mind, that speaks to that one of the important roles that we all have as helpers is to impart that information to the people that we're working with. Does that make sense to you? And is that aligned with what you're trying to accomplish?
It is, and because I've self-identified myself as a scholar, just because I've drowned myself in books and education. Here's the key thing that I want ACEs Matter to really put a dent in when it comes to understanding childhood adversity and positive experiences. Information is one thing. All right, look around people's office, they've got books everywhere. Internet, we can find information anywhere, right? What ACEs Matter is going to try to do with our platform is give people a route to connect with somebody who has the same information, right? Information will make us think. Connection gives us something to live for. So we can't just keep pushing books in people's face and no. That's good. That's where I started. That worked for me. But if I don't have anybody to connect with, then I'm alone with my hurt and my trauma again. Right. So I think clinicians, I think it would be a great practice to, you know, bring people to the information. But if we really want to elevate the conversation and elevate the level of healing that could occur, we've got to get people connected with other like-minded survivors, overcomers, right? Because it is a very lonely place when you think there's something wrong with you and you don't have anybody to talk to it about.
Right. Well, you know, there's implications of what you're suggesting. And that is, you know, I'm thinking about clinics. You know, I've run some clinics and day programs and things like that. That one important service to have considered is like creating these maybe self-help or support groups where you create opportunities for people with shared experiences to have a really safe place for them to be able to connect with each other. Because as you're saying, information kind of like addresses your head, but it's the connections that addresses your heart. And bringing that together is really the critical piece. And also the contribution of developing a service system that creates opportunities for people with shared experience to come together. I mean, that's what went on in my mind when you were sharing that. And it sounds like, say, yeah, that's exactly from what you're saying, at least let me just check in with you around that.
Yeah.
Is that how your vision of how we can create communities that can heal would involve things like that?
Yeah, that's your own point, Tony. For me, it's like, here's the golden ticket to the conversation. Not only will you leave here with information that helps you understand how you got here, but you're going to walk away connecting with somebody that's going to make sure that you are not alone in your journey as you start working through just healing yourself and then learning how to be compassionate with yourself. And then that way you can share with others. So something is tangible. I was sharing with the group before the call started is I'm in a book club with 5 other lived experience survivors. We all want to figure it out. And the youngest person in the group is 26. The eldest person is 71. I believe she's in her 70s. We are connecting and we've known each other for 3 weeks. We haven't had to share all the details of our trauma, but we found a space where there are other people who want to be vulnerable and not be judged. So we're taking the conversation of ACEs and healing, and now there's 5 of us from around different states that are all connected because we realize we're not alone in trying to figure this out. That is not an easy path to take when you want to divulge to a stranger. You don't know what that stranger is going to do with the information, right? But when for me at least, I'm at the place where that's not my responsibility. My responsibility is to keep my body safe. And what the other person, if for some reason the other person does not have good intent, that's not my position, right? My position is learn how to be compassionate if that person does break code. But the whole goal is give connection to go with the information, because it's very lonely to let's say learn your ACE score for like I did, like learn your ACE score and then not have anybody to talk to it about.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really important, issue that you're emphasizing over and over again around the importance of connection is really the path to healing. And loneliness is like the worst place to be in. And what I'm sort of like thinking about is what is it that you think practitioners or people in the mental health field, I'm sort of thinking of the kinds of things that I might do that unintentionally might be harmful, or I missed the point working with somebody who is really had significant adversity in their lives. Are there any tips or thoughts about, Tony, be careful about this, a way of approaching things? You already mentioned something like, if you make it just an intellectual thing around just information, that in and of itself might be helpful in some ways, but it's really the empathic connection that creates the opportunity for healing. But I'm just trying to get a sense of, I guess it's kind of do's and don'ts. And is there anything that comes to mind for you that you might say to all of us? Just keep this in mind when you're working with folks who've been through a lot of trauma.
Okay.
And
that's a good one.
Yeah, I know,
That's a good one. All right. So full disclosure, I think a misconception about ACEs is that the response to them is universal. That's one misconception I think we all have to practice being aware of. Although my score sits at a 10 on the abbreviated version, I will tell you that the times where I've been in therapy sessions and the therapist stopped asking questions and started making suggestions without having all of the information, I didn't feel heard or I didn't feel safe. And again, I also didn't have the words to tell her that either. I was just like, I'm just not going to go back to her. I'm just not going to go back to her. So I'm going to go back to the good experience that I had. My 41 years old, she kept asking me questions that made me pull up some of that stored trauma. And I don't even know what technique she was using. Whatever it was, it led me to realize I was resenting somebody, my mom. I was resenting my mom over something I couldn't control. And the fact that she just kept asking questions until I myself could realize what was causing me to feel this way, was helpful in that she didn't just say, well, the book says do it this way, right? I needed to feel heard. And I think, I'm guessing, that she recognized that I didn't get the template in childhood. You know, the template of like, hey, when you're feeling this way, you should say this. Like my template in childhood was a lot of aggression, verbally and physically, when we didn't get along, or when somebody disagreed, or when somebody, what we say, felt a certain kind of way. But that particular therapist, it was just that she expressed interest in my story without all the details. So express, I guess, for people with similar backgrounds like mine, what worked for me is when she expressed interest in my story without making me get into the nitty gritty of what happened.
You know, Maria Fuentes just kind of chatted in and said, you kind of hit it on the head with that. Such an important point around having that space to tell your story. And to avoid premature suggestions, advice, you know, sort of things you ought to do, but rather these questions that you're referring to are questions designed for you to be able to tell your story completely. It sounds like that's what that's what was going on. And that is a very important point, is we as practitioners, we can sometimes feel the urge to come up with a suggestion, an advice, a strategy. You know, in other words, we want to try to solve the problem rather than let's give this person space to share their story and how they see let them kind of explore. In a way, you're kind of exploring as you're answering questions to increase your understanding of what's going on in your life, what's contributing to the issues. And that, I think, is a really important message.
Yeah. And I will say the disclaimer is not everybody will be ready for that. Like, I think my grandfather told me a long time ago that I was just a very curious kid. So I think, something responsible for practitioners to do is obviously, once you understand, some clients won't have a word to say, like they want to be told what to do. I just happen to not be one of those people. I just needed to be heard, because the solution is inside of us. We just need the right connection with the source. Once that connection is back online, now I feel safe just like talking, and then this light bulb just goes off.
Well, you see that you've just made another important point, I think, is that, and maybe that's part of mirroring and shadowing, is kind of to ensure that you align your approach that is aligned with the needs and the style and how that person wants to relate. So for you, having kind of a lot of inquiries, not being given direction, may create a safety for you. And for someone else, they may feel unsafe in that kind of situation. They may need a little bit more guidance. So that is a really important message as well, that there isn't a single way to approach this with everyone. Is we have to take a lot of time to understand what's the comfort zone of this individual. What is it that they can engage in a way that feels helpful to them? So that, I think, is a really important point that you're making as well. Something I'm reminded of, something you said earlier around reference to your body. Like somehow that there's an attunement or an awareness of how the trauma and all those adversity sort of gets represented or manifest in a person's physical body. Did I miss that, or did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, and I am still studying this, but now I know that there's a few like 911 signs in my body that she does not feel safe. And they always start in my gut. You ever heard people say you get a gut feeling, like for whatever reason, there's a 911 call that I can now recognize when I don't feel safe, or when resentment's coming on. Resentment is a big one that I've got to get fleshed out of my system, if you will, whatever the word is. But without giving all the details of my story, I realized there was a couple of incidents in my childhood that caused me to freeze because I was being overpowered. by people I trusted. Ah, where did that knot come from? Oh my God, I just had a knot in my throat. So speaking of the body, she just reminded me, I mean, she literally teleported me to the past, to that moment when somebody who had more power than me was taking advantage of me. So so now that feeling is in my throat. So she's talking to me, right? She's letting me know that this is something that makes her feel unsafe, but I feel connected. So I can share that. I now can connect me freezing and feeling like, oh, I just lose. Like I'm just might as well give up. It shows up in my work life. If I feel like the work is too overpowering, or what we use now is overwhelming, I freeze and I will withdraw and just teleport to someplace else until this is over. The thing about real life, present moment, it's not going to be over, right? Like this pop quiz is going to keep coming back until I handle it differently. But now I can understand that when I get to that place, my body is being reminded that I don't feel safe. And so now I have to intentionally practice stuff to get her back online. And yesterday, a situation came up where I realized she was talking to me that I was feeling very resentful of some grown-ups that had let me down. Right? Professionals in my workspace that let me down. And for those of us that have to work with other adults, you're probably going to run into people that don't follow through as often as they said they would. I can be resentful of that. So when my body started to talk to me, I knew in that moment, I just needed to take a break and go listen to those thoughts. So yeah, definitely. I don't know if that answers your question, but our bodies tell us everything.
No,
they tell us everything.
Yeah, I mean, you answered it and then some, because I think you made a very important point that we may miss as helpers, is having a better understanding or inquiring, helping a person to recognize what their kind of physical vulnerabilities are. Where does it show up? Whether it's in your gut, or whether it's in lower back pain, or it's in indigestion, or it's in headaches, or whatever it might be, is to be attuned to your physiological reactions. It's kind of understanding your nervous system. And that's like a really important point. And as you mentioned, you know, there are times you can either fight, you can flight, or you can freeze when you're dealing with situations. So that's like a really important piece that I think we as practitioners may not appreciate the value of exploring that with someone, so that they can increase their awareness. Because you're saying that gives you a signal that you're under stress. And for you, resentment seems to be like when there's disappointments, it just reminds you of other disappointments, right? And I think we as helpers need to create a space where people have a chance to make those connections. And we're looking at the body is an area that I don't think we tend to look at as much, but you're reminding us, don't forget about it.
Yeah. Oh, your body's gonna, like, just then, like, oh, it went right there. It's like, oh, you're gonna try to get this out. You're gonna try to get this out. But the more we can get it from being stored, so that it comes out as words or art, or action, like the better we can start to notice that communication from our body. Super, super important. I mean, it's a game changer. It's a game changer, whether it's sweat in your hands, tense in your shoulders, it's trying to tell you something.
Right. And we can learn from what our body is telling us. That's like a really important point. I just want to switch to going outside of the looking at our field in behavioral health, because I think your vision and your mission is really much broader than that. It's around the community, the recognition of how many people are suffering in communities where they're experiencing a great deal of adversity, who aren't even part of the behavioral healthcare system. In fact, some estimates are that most people who could really benefit are not even in the system at all. They're just out there suffering. And could you say a little bit about that? Because I think you have like a vision of how do we get this information out to the public so that they could use some of this information to address some of the suffering in their lives. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that is accurate. And this is a work in progress. So Aces Matter will turn 2 years old come next month.
Right.
So she'll be 2, and still in her infancy stages, she has this vision that everybody deserves to learn about this, right? how do we take what Dr. Tony says? How do we take what the medical world says or the clinical world says about healing and all the different modalities? We call them formulas. How do we take that and get people, for lack of a better word, with a third grade education in a 40-year-old body to connect with the information that we're trying to share, right? So my goal with ACEs Matter is to educate adults who are willing to learn about the causes and consequences of ACEs and help them become really fluent enough to hold the conversation in their own communities, in their own zip codes, and with their own social media platforms. You don't need to have a doctorate degree. You just need to be working on it, right? And get people to the water, which is starting the conversation. At the end of the day, like they told us back in the day, you can't force them to drink, but it is unfair that since 1994, and this is just my personal, this is probably my, there's a trauma word for this and I can't think of it, but I personally think that it is unfair that this information has been out here for so long and not everybody has learned about it. So I believe that the person with the loudest voice or microphone is going to change that. And so instead of us waiting to put all the onus on the clinicians, what if communities started trying to understand this? And then, as I was telling Jim, what if we became like mini paramedics? Like that's something that person could connect to until they can get the professional help. What if we taught people in a way that makes sense to them what Dr. Anda and Folletti were trying to say? Because for me, the only reason why I learned about this ACE study is because I happened to have a privilege that put me in a conference where other people were paying $1,200 to be there.
Right.
So I think that if we can teach others who are willing to learn about not just ACEs, but also like the counter to ACEs, and then giving them a microphone and a platform to go out there and share with whoever will listen. So I'm starting this academy this summer where I will have 15 adults. Currently, I have 10 adults in 9 different states. We're still recruiting a few more, but as many people as we can find that say, ooh, I want to learn about this and go talk about it. And then we give them the credentials and the tools and the script. Let them practice with how to say it. And then they go out and they model the conversation, right where they live, right where they work. And you don't hold people accountable, right? You don't force people to come to it. You invite them. And the truth is, because none of us got to skip childhood, this conversation is relevant to everybody.
Right. You know, what it reminds me of, I was at a conference recently. On the panel was a councilman from Baltimore, Zeke Cohen. And he and I were on this panel together. And what they're trying to do in Baltimore really is to take what you've just described and try to make it a vision for an entire city. And that is the idea that like who can communicate and provide this information. And you can think of so many entities, faith-based programs, congregations, there's an opportunity to get this information out. In healthcare, there's an opportunity. In education, in your library, you know, almost all city age. I mean, when you think about it, it's and this is the kind of thing that they're discussing in Baltimore and looking to get legislation around that, is to make this notion of how do we heal environments, heal our communities, and everybody plays a role. It isn't just let those psychologists handle it or those social workers, but we all have a stake in this, and we all can play a contributing role. And I think that, you know, that conversation I had with the councilman and seeing what they're trying to do, it was an eye opener for me. And it sounds like you're kind of, or you understand that. You understood that before I understood it, is the role that communities can play in really educating and then connecting, creating opportunities for connection as well.
Super important, Dr. Tony. And the last thing I want to plug into that is, for every job many of us have ever had, there's usually 99% of the time they want a background check done on you before they hire you, because they want to know if you've committed any crimes.
Right.
You know what they don't ask? What caused you to commit those crimes?
Right.
What if they started asking for our ACE score? Not that I'm advocating for that, right? But the fact that we don't talk about this enough, and then we end up with employees or coworkers that we can't figure out, like, how did they get in here? Or bosses or whatever, right? So, I really think it's an important conversation that I think somebody said in the chat that needs to be normalized. We're not trying to label or single anybody out, but we're trying to better understand is how do we fix this problem that got here before us? We didn't cause our own ACEs. You didn't cause yours. I didn't cause mine, right? So how do we normalize this conversation so that we don't become adults who need to heal from their childhood?
Yeah. I mean, what you're really, the call to action, if I can surmise from what you're saying, is how communities can create sort of these healing opportunities and also prevent ACEs from occurring in the first place. And in what way would it transform a society if we were able to reduce the number of adverse experiences that children had growing up? You'd probably completely transform a community.
You would.
Probably solve most of the social problems that we encounter day in and day out.
Yeah.
If we would make sure that every child grew up with safety, with love, with resources, where there was the absence of neglect and a supportive community and connections. I think that is the call to action for all of us. And I so appreciate you sharing that with us, Cendie. I want to give the audience an opportunity now to ask any question, and we'll do that for the next 15 minutes or so.
All righty.
Yeah, folks. So yeah, please feel free to chat in your question. One already did come up during the course of the conversation. And I think you touched on this very, very direct question. How do we create infrastructures in schools to support a trauma lens? Yeah.
I'm going to say this as somebody who entered a classroom at 23 in a special ed classroom with the kids who have the most needs. Teachers, staff member, anybody around children, it should be like a background check is required. So should a mental health. I need to know, are you working on your mental health? Because it's not, the moment that kid triggers you, you're going to add more adversities on in the school building, which then becomes adversities for the community if there's nobody home for the kids. So I think teachers, obviously we have enough overwhelm as it is between all the transactional things that need to happen. But I can think of a few principles that I would like to not remember that were not good for me with my trauma carrying self at 23 and 25, right? Principals who were principling just like me with their ACEs. So I think for schools is like investing in teachers' emotional health, investing in the staff's emotional health, because they're already stretched thin as it is. And then add on top of that, you're sending kids to school with them that have these ACEs in the making, right?
Yeah.
And so if that makes sense, like I think schools could do justice by implementing practices that allow teachers to do their own self-work and creating a safe space for that to happen. But it definitely has to start with the top, because the top is going to set the tone of how everything goes in that school. And if I had a do-over, Tony and James, I would have definitely done that, because my first year running a school building was with 6 first-year teachers and 1 second-year teacher and 300 plus kids who were all coming from an ACE-inflicted community. Right? That wasn't fair to the kids, and nor was it fair to these teachers who thought education was the solution to solving the world, and now here we are all trying to figure out our own triggers, if you would, baptism by fire, I guess. So that would be my thing. I hope I answered that question, but if I had a do-over, I definitely would have wanted to do more of mind, body, soul work before putting a whole bunch of 11 and 12-year-olds in the hands of adults.
You're getting so many supportive statements, Cendie. Folks are, but also I think in many ways you're prompting folks to think about making connections and spreading more information about ACEs and ACEs awareness. I think that trying to see if there's other specific questions that have come up.
I see some people were asking about signing up, so I'm just dropping the volunteer thing. Obviously, the website is a work in progress, but if those people are interested, I just left that in there. I saw a couple of people asking, so I left the website contact us page.
Okay, great, Cendie. There is a very specific question, and it's a question about a specific therapy. But maybe if you have thoughts, I don't know if you have knowledge of it, but are you familiar with EMDR? It's a specific form of therapy for folks who've been impacted by trauma. So there is a question about that. And I'm wondering too, though, if you're not sure about EMDR, the question is also about, implementing tools like EMDR and other evidence-based practices in therapy. But I guess part of the question is just what your response. Are you familiar with it and therapeutic approaches that that can help?
Well, I have information on it. So that's going to be one therapy that I did not personally try, but I've heard a lot about it. In addition to brain spotting was another one that came up. So what's going to happen in the ACEs Matter formula, because we realize that everybody's needs will be different. I envision a place where people select the therapies that are going to work best for them. Brain spotting, I tried that approach after learning about MDR, but my goal is to have a list of different types of therapies that will work. We don't know. All of our trauma will have been experienced different. Our scores might be the same, but we have no idea what's going on in that person's body. So a big part of ACEs Matter formula is allowing people to find their own, right? And if that doesn't work, right, we're going to obviously vet any professionals that we recommend once we get to that stage in ACEs Matter. But the idea is to let people know, like, here's what MDR does, here's what brain spotting does, here's what, play therapy and all these different options, because we really don't know. Somebody's formula in Texas may be different than what somebody's formula in South Carolina needs to be, but we definitely want the information to be compact and in a place where people can easily make that decision. And if that therapist or if that situation didn't work for you, okay, let's keep trying. Because again, your formula may be different from mine, but I'll tell you what worked for me was inquiry. Like, I found a therapist that really knew how to ask me questions. But again, that may be different for somebody else.
That's a great point, Cendie, and I hope you and any support we can give you in that work. But yeah, it's there are many evidence-based treatments that have been developed out there, but it's always a matter of finding the right fit, and certain therapeutic approaches don't work for everyone. So I'm so glad you're bringing up that point. There's a question here also about, again, as someone with lived experience, this is such a critical question. It's a very simple question. Can you truly heal from trauma or just mitigate your responses and reactions?
Bernadette, that is a great question. We talked about that so again, from my experience and the people that I'm around that are doing this work, and again, this is my own personal experience. I don't even know if it can be vetted on websites of the people who study this in real time. I think it is an ongoing process. I think healing is an ongoing process because you never know how your body's going to respond to something, right? That reminds you of something from your childhood or XYZ. So I think for me, it is definitely how we respond to it. So I think she said something about responses or reactions. Just last night, I had a triggering situation, even though I'm doing the work. I realized that it's not about the other people. If I want my body to feel safe, then I have to practice how I'm going to respond when that trigger in this situation, it was resentment. I felt like I was being let down. I had to make a choice on how I was going to respond or react. Now, my body tells me if I become abrupt or if I say something, that's probably a reasonable reaction. I'm not calling it an excuse, but it's a reasonable reaction because my body's just trying to get back to safe zone, right? But for those of us that are going down this path, there's no end date, right? I think it's just a dash. I think, and that's for me personally, I hadn't gotten to, upper levels, but right now I think it's just a dash, and it just means you just have to keep practicing it. But for me, you definitely feel a lot better when you don't respond the same way that you did the last time that didn't work out. So definitely mitigate. I think it definitely helped us mitigate our reactions. And here's the last thing I'm going to say to that, Bernadette. I have learned that my response will take the path of least resistance. Here's what I mean by that. If somebody does XYZ to me and my body doesn't like it, my mind doesn't like it, in the past, the quickest response was a verbal, gut check or whatever, or saying something inappropriate. That's the easiest path. It doesn't take me any thought. I could just let it out. But if I then take a moment to practice before I even get in the game, like if this person says this, what do I need to do? I need to breathe, or maybe I need to step away. But in general, our body's going to take the path of least resistance. Oh, I'll just snap on this person, or cuss them out, or I'll walk away, or I'll go hide in the closet. I will fight, flight, or freeze. The path of least resistance is what our body is used to. So if we want to train it to do something different, we have to start practicing before we're in the game.
You just mentioned the alternative to fight, flight, or freeze, and that's really problem solving.
Yeah.
It's like that's what you did, right? You said, how am I going to react to this particular situation, planning it in advance.
Mm-hmm.
That's the alternative that we have,
Mm-hmm.
is engage in problem solving.
Yeah, but you got to teach your body how to do that.
You got to teach, right? It's exactly right.
One of our first technical courses in the residency program is teaching people about the vagus nerve. So I'll have some experts come in and talk about, like, what does it mean to get your vagus nerve out of Vegas for a little while, if you will, because our vagus nerve has a lot of stuff stored in it, and it's going to dictate how we respond to triggers. So one of the first things I want technically for my reachers to learn is, what is this thing called the vagus nerve that we've never heard of, and why is it so important in our physiological responses? That is like the important nerve that we need. It's the 10th nerve. We've got to learn about it. And so now how do we share with people how to reset that? Cold water and gargling is an easy thing that doesn't cost a thing, right? It's just a lot of hidden information in the text that we just want to bring to people's awareness and let them choose, like, hey, is this going to work for me?
Terrific. Any other questions coming in, Jim?
There are. But I realize we're getting short on time, but I think we can take one more. I am curious. I think one of the comments, and I wasn't sure, Al, I know you had a point here, but he says, I'm in upstate New York. We're building a tiny home sober living village. How does this get installed into our intake as well as community that we're building to mitigate the HPA access response? Can this be scaled? And I'm not, there's some parts of that, but I am curious from your perspective, Cendie. I think that brings up for me an issue. You talked a little bit earlier about, creating that safe space and things that we can do just to hear the story and process it. But I am wondering, and you've kind of touched on it a little bit, how do we what's the best way to address the issue of getting information that we can obtain from folks when they're coming into services? I know you joked earlier about sort of getting an ACEs score on folks, and I think you were talking about teachers. But I guess there's a part of that, even for folks who are getting services, what's the safest way to ask questions to make sure that on the one hand, we're getting the information we need, possibly about the impact of trauma, but also not scaring people and not pushing people away, because it is such a heavy topic and a heavy issue.
I'm gonna give a shout out to a nonprofit hospital here in Orlando, Florida, called the Grace Medical Center, founded by a doctor who realized that everybody should have access to healthcare regardless if they have insurance or not. This organization last year started implementing ACE screening, but she has one rule. You do not screen until they come back 3 times. Because the first thing is to build connection. And what they're doing in those situations in the intake appointments is they're learning about early relational health. So there's just a different way to word it without getting into the nitty gritty of what their childhood was like. tell me about tell me about the relationships you had in childhood, right? It's just like an open conversation. You have no idea that 2 visits from now, I'm going to have you take this quiz, right? So they started digging in to try to understand the impact of lack of early relational health. But to get people to come back, not everybody is going to be ready to divulge that information up front. So I would say 2 things: finding out what their relationships were like in childhood. This is what this hospital was doing. And then the second thing that was really important is that every person that sees that client throughout the hospital has to know their window of tolerance. Not just the client that's coming in, but also the staff member that's receiving them. Because if your window of tolerance is low because you had traffic coming in, or you and spouse got whatever it was that may have you on the brink of not being able to be present in that moment, that needs to be in check before we allow you to be in the space of somebody that is already hurting. So those 2 things: early relational health questions, as much as you can get. And obviously you have to know where that person is in terms of their tolerance level going into that conversation.
Well, I think we're just about out of time.
Yeah, we are.
But I want to really thank you, Cendie. The chats we've been getting in it's very gratifying to us that we've had you present and share your story in a way that's been received so well by the audience. That it's so much that in terms of appreciating the comments that you've been making and how you've shared your perspective. So I just really want to thank you for just a terrific conversation where I think you're going to have people continuing to think about what you've shared with them and the implications for themselves, as well as for the folks that they work with. And so we thank you so much for your contribution.
Thank you, everybody.